Okay, well, it's 11:05, so as people come into the waiting room, I'll admit them, but we'll get going because we have a lot to cover in a short time. So here's for any new people that just arrived, here's just a few points to keep in mind during the workshop. If you can take a moment to go to our check-in, and that just asks a couple questions, and that there's a place to put your email so we can email you the survey at the end of the workshop as well. All right, so I'll just leave this up and then I'll just start my intro. So thank you so much for being here today. This is our first virtual workshop for Green Teams of Canada, so it's quite exciting. We're also live on Facebook, which is a first for us as well. And yeah, my name is Amanda and I run the Greater Victoria Green Team program, which is part of Green Teams of Canada. And before we get going, I just want to acknowledge that the land that we're situated on, it's the Lekwungen and Sinkotan speaking peoples who remain the original and ongoing stewards of this land. And we, the Greater Victoria Green Team, feel humbled to run our program on this beautiful land. So the last couple of months have been quite interesting for most of us. I think almost everyone on the planet has been affected by the COVID-19 situation, and particularly with the Greater Victoria Green Team, and the Lower Mainland Green Team, we had to stop our outdoor activities quite abruptly about 2 months ago. And our program really focuses on social isolation, giving people a sense of belonging, and coordinating activities that bring people together in groups connected to where we live. And so we wanted to keep that going during this time of physical isolation. And we've created a couple opportunities for our community. So we've had a few check-in sessions, virtual check-in sessions with our volunteers, as well as creating Facebook groups for the Lower Mainland Green Team and us here in Victoria. And so during one of the sessions we had with our Green Team volunteers, one of our volunteers came up with an idea to have a virtual workshop as part of the Invasive Species Month, which is May. And over the last couple weeks, since May 2nd is when we came up with the idea, a group of us have been putting this together. So this event, or this workshop, is largely organized by our Green Team volunteers. So it's a little bit unique in that the presenters have researched and they're going to be presenting to you about invasive species. So like our Greater Victoria Green Team and Lower Mainland Green Team events, we learn in a hands-on way. And so this is a very exciting day for us. And so the Greater Victoria Green Team is part of Green Teams of Canada charity, and we work to empower community to care for nature. This program started several years ago with the idea from Lita Salatian, who I'd like to introduce now, and it's grown to become this amazing movement across BC. And I would like to introduce you to Lita.
Hi, everybody. Yes, so I'll take you back to January of 2011. I was actually sitting in this very basement, and I was thinking to myself that every time I went out to a stewardship activity, I found that it tended to be much older people or Cub Scouts age trying to get their badges, and that whole middle age range between 12 and 40 were missing. They weren't coming out and getting engaged with nature, and they weren't getting their hands dirty or planting native species or removing invasives or really, really being engaged in an action helping the environment. So my background's psychology, so I'm very interested in responsible environmental behavior, and I am a community organizer, and I have an environmental studies educational background as well. So what I did is I combined all of those things, and I decided to contact a whole bunch of parks and ask them if they wanted to get a group of volunteers out to remove invasives and plant native species, or do cleanup, anything that the parks needed to improve the park and enhance that the area, the ecosystem in there. So they said sure, and so I went on to Meetup, started a Meetup page, called it the Lower Mainland Green Team, and this was, I told my husband I wanted to get a logo and I wanted trees and a mountain, and that was his drawing on the left side, and that's me with pencil crayons drawing the logo to make it look a little nicer. This truly was a grassroots effort, just, you know, pen and paper. Anyway, so I went to my, I got on my bicycle and I rode to my very first activity. So the next slide, I think it is. Yeah, that one. So I had that on the back of in my backpack, and I rode my bike to the coffee shop and got my donated muffins, which are in the background, and my homemade sign. I didn't have any tools. I didn't know anything about invasive species. I knew nothing about the actual activity itself. Park staff were there who gave the volunteers the expertise about how to identify invasive species and how to remove them, and provided them with the gloves and the tools. And as you can see, there was a reporter there on our first event. So that was our very, very, very first event, March 6, 2011. And to my surprise, my outreach methods reached that 12 to 40-year-old range. And that was the demographic that I was getting, that we were getting out, which was really awesome and amazing. And so there are other reasons why, behind the scenes, as to why I started this group. Social isolation. I think that I heard that Metro Vancouver, especially this area, is the second most socially isolated city in Canada. So there's lots of people, but it doesn't mean you're getting connected with other people in a meaningful way. And then the other piece, and it also leads to health issues when you're socially isolated, mental health issues. And people are also spending a lot of time on screens. We looked at the stats. It was between 7 and 9 hours a day we're spending in front of screens, which is ironic because we're spending time in front of the screen right now. Yeah, the more time you spend in front of the screen, the more time you're sitting down and being sedentary, the less you're going outside and getting connected with nature. So there's a disconnection to nature. And my environmental psychology background is, well, why would you take care of nature if you're disconnected from it, if you don't care about it, if you're not getting out there and getting engaged with nature? So yeah, so all those pieces, social isolation, tackling social isolation, the sedentary lifestyle, and the disconnection to nature. And also we wanted to raise environmental awareness. A lot of people want to do something about climate change, and they want to go out there and do something environmental. They just don't know what. And we're providing the what. We're just creating an opportunity. That's it. And it's really the volunteers that are coming out and inspiring us to keep going and keep running these activities. So that's all I've got to say, I think, at this point.
Thank you so much, Rita. So just briefly, a little bit about the Greater Victoria Green Team. What we've done, there's a lot of new people here that have never volunteered before with either program. So this is a group of us here at Esquimalt Sax Point Park. So you can see the mix of ages and range of ages and backgrounds. And we really work to connect and build and empower diverse communities through hands-on activities that enhance health, well-being, and environmental stewardship. So the two programs have grown to become the largest volunteer groups in the province. We have thousands of volunteers we engage every year. We organize about 100 different, up to 100 different activities in green spaces throughout Metro Vancouver and Greater Victoria. These are some of the activities that we find ourselves doing often. Number one, I would say invasive species removal, planting native species, cleaning up shorelines, rivers, streams, and food security education. So these are activities, but our goal is to, as the Green Team, is to really bring people together and, like what Lita said, address issues around isolation and feeling a lack of sense of belonging while doing something impactful to our environment. So just last year, the Greater Victoria Green Team removed a lot of invasive plants, 462 square cubic meters from an area about 10,000 square meters. So the volunteers here today, thank you so much for all of your hard work, because it is because of you that has made such a huge impact. And a couple other things, important aspects of our group: we empower environmental leaders, which is represented in this workshop, being led by our volunteer. We introduce volunteers to existing groups. So we work with over 100 different collaborators between Vancouver and Metro Vancouver and Greater Victoria, and they're the ones who provide that ecological expertise. They're the ones who've been working on particular sites, and we come together to build their capacity for what we're able to accomplish. We really believe that teamwork aspect, that we really need to come together, work together, and make it really accessible and inclusive to volunteer to take care of our environment. So just a little brief overview of invasive species. There's a few people who have never learned about invasive plants and species, so I actually looked up some definitions, because when you're so familiar with something, you kind of forget what they are. So here's a definition. So they're plants, animals, and organisms that are not native to the area that they've been invading, and whose introduction and spread harms the native species and economy. So basically, what an invasive species has the potential to turn a once diverse landscape with hundreds of species into a monoculture, into one species, which affects the food web, which affects our native pollinators and birds, and so forth. Most invasive species have been introduced unintentionally by human activities into places outside their native habitat. And once they're removed from having their natural predators and diseases, they reproduce and spread unchecked, and they can survive better than the native species in that area. Here we are. And so it's a joke, often I hear humans are the ultimate invasive species, but we can't do much about that if that's your view. But what we can do as humans is work to reduce the spread and reduce the impact caused by invasive plants. So some of the impacts include environmental, health, and economical. And so invasive non-native species are the second most significant threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. And so in Greater Victoria, we have the Garry Oak ecosystem, and Scotch broom and gorse it's really fragmented and really impacted this fragile ecosystem. It's one of the most diverse ecosystems we find in Canada. So Scotch broom and gorse pose some of the most serious threats to our local ecosystem on Vancouver Island by shading out low-growing plants and altering conditions needed by many birds and butterflies and other species. And so Richard and Julian will be talking about Scotch broom later on in the presentation. And health, so there's some species that pose significant health risks, and Dorsa will be talking about giant hogweed. And so it's important to reduce the spread of these invasive plants, not just for the environment and economy, but at times for our health as well. So here's the next slide. So what can we do? So instead of answering this question right now, this is one of the questions we will be talking about during breakout session. But one of the things we can do is work together and come together and volunteer with groups to manually remove invasive plants where we find them in our urban ecosystems. So we're not the only group that does this. There's hundreds of amazing groups. And so that's one thing we can do, but we'll discuss other ideas during the breakout sessions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Z Tian. I'm gonna take my spotlight off.
Hey guys, just double check that I'm muted. Awesome. Hi guys, I'm Z. So I'm going to be one of the presenters today. I'm recently moved to the West Coast and I wanted to get out. And I found the Greater Victoria Green Team on Meetup and just kind of dove in, and it became something that I really enjoy, and now I'm doing all of this. Just quick idea how I got here. So May is Invasive Species Month, and we were discussing how we can do a lot of things we were trying to do before. I really enjoyed the sense of community that the Green Team brought, being able to go out and connect with nature, learn about nature. But because of COVID-19, we can't be out there, we can't be together physically. So how do we try and get as much as that as possible right now? And when Lita asked, what does that look like, to try and imitate all those, and I thought of this workshop in terms of everyone still gets to learn about invasive species, learn about nature and conservation, and still come together as a community and meet up, but in a virtual space like this. So I'm super excited for us to be presenting today and learning about invasive species together. So without further ado, let's introduce all the presenters. So there's me, kind of introduced myself already. I just moved last year from the East Coast into Victoria, and in the last few months, I just moved to Vancouver. Yeah, awesome. And next, ooh, I see the screen, but I believe Cassandra is next.
Hi everyone, I'm Cassandra, and I started volunteering, I think it was last year, with the Greater Victoria Green Team. I was mostly pulling weeds or pulling invasives out of Mystic Vale, and I found that really fun, and I find it very, just in terms of restoration in general, very satisfying to see what plants come back after you've pulled them out. So I'm a student at UVic. I study restoration of natural systems, and I work there as well. I teach labs, so I think that's yeah, I did my degree in biology, so I just like love learning about plants, and that's what I find a lot in common with this group. Love learning about plants. So it's me.
Awesome. And I think next would be Dorsa.
Hi, my name is Dorsa. I studied at UBC. I studied biochemistry and I graduated last year. I joined the Lower Mainland Green Team in 2012 when I was still in high school, and I really enjoyed getting to go out to different parks and do hands-on work with the community. So it had both the social component and also just being able to be in nature and giving back to our local parks. And today I'll be presenting about giant hogweed.
Awesome. And lastly, we have Richard and Julian.
Hello, Richard here.
And I am Julian.
I've been working with the Green Team for a little over 2 years.
And I've been working with them.
And I've been pulling broom for about 40 years. So this is something that that we're both pretty committed to and interested in. I work for Camosun College.
And I work for my school.
And we're very happy to be presenting on Scotch broom today.
So I'll be the first one presenting, and I'll be presenting on the Himalayan blackberry. So just give me a quick second and I'll be sharing my presentation with you. Awesome. There we go. Awesome. So I chose Himalayan blackberry. It was one of the first invasive species that I found in BC when I moved over. I got really excited. I saw all these blackberries growing in summer. I was like, this costs a fortune to buy in the grocery store. So I just went ham and ate every single one I could find. But then I started volunteering and I noticed that we were starting pulling them out, and I learned that there were invasive species. There's a native variety that's kind of overtaking and it's having a lot of impact on the environment. So it was great to know that even though something is so tempting and so great like this, it has a negative impact as well, and we need to be careful about what we see out there and about invasive species as well. So quick general overview of the name and classification. It's named Rubus armeniacus. That's the Linnaeus name, and it's in the family Rosaceae. So the same as roses, hence why it has thorns. It's also called Rubus procerus or Rubus discolor, and it's considered a noxious weed and invasive species in North America. So its origin, it's actually native to Armenia and northern Iran, not the Himalayas, which I'll get to in a second. And then it was brought to Germany in 1835. So from Germany and the rest of Western Europe, it was then brought over to North America for cultivation because of its berries. And then it became really well established in the Pacific Northwest because that's the kind of environment that the blackberries really thrive in. So Himalayan blackberry is kind of a misnomer, and it took a while to find out why I actually got that name, since that's no connection to Himalayas. So in 1880s, Luther Burbank a horticulturalist. He wanted to develop new hybrid or plants by breeding them and trying to get a really juicy and like high yield plant. And he created the Himalayan blackberry after buying a pack of seeds that he thought was from the Himalayas in India. And then he created this really nice, juicy and sweet berries, and he named it Himalayan Giant for how big they were. Because they were so popular and so great, they spread like fire. Like everyone was buying them and planting them, and they escaped gardens, and now they took over the whole of Pacific Northwest. So that's how it came about. Nothing to do with Himalayas. Yeah. So to identify them, if you ever seen them out, you probably can easily identify them. They're just these blackberries. They're blackberries. They're red if they aren't ripe. Compared to the native species, they grow really tall. So if you find them like hip height, like almost as tall as you, those are generally the Himalayan blackberries. Their spines are really thick, and they have prickly thorns on them. The leaves are usually in clusters of 5, compared to native species that are usually in 3. The flowers are white as well. And yeah, the berries we already talked about. So the native species are the trilling blackberries. They're usually closer to the ground, hence trilling, and their leaves are in threes. The berries ripen earlier than Himalayan blackberries. So while the blackberries, Himalayan blackberries, you see them more. If you look on the ground, they're those are the native ones, and they generally ripen earlier. So the way they grow and reproduce. So the seeds germinate in the spring, and they don't really grow well in shade, but they really thrive well in a lot of different conditions. So even if the soil isn't moist, and if there's some shade, it can still grow, but it does prefer moist soil. It prefers not a lot of shade. And the way that it kind of really gets so big and large thickets like that is that the canes arch over, and then they reach the ground, and then they form dotted canes. And from these dotted canes, they kind of grow into these big thickets using the dead older canes that support. And they grow into these like massive, like impassable blackberry bushes. So the ecological impacts of having so much of them out there is that they, like a lot of native species, invasive species, they outcompete the local native vegetation, especially low-growing ones. And that causes a lot of flooding and erosion as you no longer have the same amount of support in the soil. And also prevents the establishment of shade-intolerant trees. So the young saplings of Gary oak, for example, that's really important to BC, and a ponderosa pine, they get affected a lot. And another thing is that because of the lack of these trees, you end up affecting bird breeding, and it lowers biodiversity overall. And one thing that's important to note, though, is blackberry bushes have been found to be a nesting site now for native passerine birds. So when we remove them, it's something that's really important to consider to replace them with something similar that fills a similar ecological role. The thickets also limit animal movement, so larger animals just can't pass through them, and they tend to take over streamlines and stream channels and stream banks. So the economic impact, they cost a ton, like millions of dollars to remove in North America. They affect agriculture and forestry, and the big thing is the grapevines in BC especially. So the bacteria for the fungi for Pierce's disease is bacteria fungi. I need to double check, but it's affects grapevine in BC. And since we have so much viticulture in BC, that's a really important thing to tackle. To remove them, if you ever done one of our removal events, we go out there and we get really thick gardening gloves, and we get loppers and shovels to get through them. They can be quite a lot of work to get through, but it's super satisfying when we do. So we pull them up at the roots below the root crown. And in the picture, you can see that they're like really thick roots. And if you don't get those out, they regrow, and it just makes it a lot worse. So it's important to get in deep down there and just get rid of that root crown. And if you don't, they grow taller plants, and it produces canopy. If you grow taller plants, you can also produce canopy that limits their growth and makes it easier to control them in the future. So what has a green team done? So this is one of the pictures in Victoria that the Greater Victoria Green Team has worked on. On the left is a before shot of all the blackberry bushes that were there before, and on the right is after we cleared it all out. And that's all done one afternoon. So it's not impossible to do it. We just need to get out there, and it's generally a great time. So yeah, thank you for listening. And these are all the sources that I have if you ever want to learn more about it. Cool. So next up, I believe we have Cassandra.
Cassandra, maybe tell us why you chose periwinkle.
Periwinkle, yeah. So periwinkle is just a plant that I've noticed for a long time in my area. So I never thought about it too much, but then I just noticed it was spreading, like it was in the garden in the apartment where I am. And I started to wonder, it looks like an intentional plant. It's just, you'll see, hopefully in a second, you'll see it's a beautiful plant. Here we go. So periwinkle. So it's a beautiful plant. It's got perfect looking green leaves, and it's got these beautiful like blue purple flowers that just look perfect. And I thought for sure it was an intentional plant, but then I started noticing it on streets and in parks, and I thought maybe it's not an intentional plant. I better check if this is native or not. So I found out, yes, in fact, periwinkle is invasive. So here's what it looks like. You can have a look. They kind of tend to grow on vines. They look really, they get very thick and big. So let's see a bit about the history of periwinkle. It's native to Europe, Northwest Africa, or Southwest Asia, so kind of the Mediterranean region. It was introduced to North America as an ornamental plant, and it's still sold as an ornamental plant today, surprisingly. So the species there's two species that we typically see in Victoria. There's Vinca major, which is the greater periwinkle, and Vinca minor, which is the lesser periwinkle or myrtle. So there's between the two, they look very similar. I personally haven't figured out how to tell the difference, but generally, as the name suggests, major is bigger and minor is smaller. Major is a little bit more aggressive in terms of invasion. So I think the other difference I noticed or read about was that the V major, they have up to 4 flowers per stem, whereas the V minor typically has just 1. And V minor is also what is known as myrtle. So just a couple interesting facts about periwinkle. So the alkaloids from the vinca plant are used in chemotherapy, so there is sort of a medical use for this. And it's not to be confused with another local periwinkle. I'm not sure if you can see it, but at the bottom of the screen there, I've got two of these little shells. We have an aquatic species called periwinkle that is native, and it's in Victoria, but you just see it at low tide in the high intertidal. So how it appears, it has leaves that are oblong, or oval to ovate, or somewhere in between those two shapes. And it flowers in May, June, so you'll see it out right now if you go to parks. I see it quite often here in Saanich. And the flowers are typically blue purple, but not always. I'm not sure why. I was looking up periwinkles on Amazon to see what came up and see if they were still sold. And they had quite a few different varieties. I suspect these aren't V major and V minor, but these are some other ones that are still sold for ornamental purposes. So too bad that they are still being sold, but there you are. There's many different colors of periwinkle, but not so much here. So the biology of periwinkle, sorry that the photo here is not great, but it's a clonal colony plant. So what appears to be one shrub is actually many genetically identical plants. So it reproduces via stolons, which I suspect are kind of like the canes from Blackberry. There are stems which form roots at different intervals. And tried to pull out a stolon near the apartment. It didn't turn out so well, but you can see there's the top, that's the sort of lower stem of the mother plant, like the plant that generated the stolon, and then there's the root of the daughter plant. So I didn't get the root of the mother plant, but I sort of got the part above it, and then there's the root from the daughter plant, and there's a long thin green stolon in between them. So the stolons themselves and the vines are maybe about 3 or 4 millimeters wide from what I saw. They're pretty thin. So they're periwinkles are hardy. They're found in a large variety of environments. They tolerate dryness for soils, and they can tolerate different levels of sunlight. So they can have full sun, of course, that's best for most plants, or they can have some shade as well. So the soil pH can be quite a range, I believe, from acidic to alkaline. And so the combination of being very hardy and reproducing so quickly via the stolons makes it very invasive. And its main impact is that it crowds out other native plants. So where is it found? I did a search for periwinkle in Victoria, and it was pretty much found all over the city. I've seen it in private property, so gardens and yards like my own, or the one that I live on. I've seen it on roadsides, and I've seen it in parks. So here's a recent picture of a trip I took to the park, and there's some periwinkle on the right-hand side. Just a bit of a background info. This trail it's on a slope, so it's kind of I'm not sure if it's an official trail or not, but so to the right of the photo, there's a slope that goes down quite a few meters, maybe 10 meters, maybe even a bit more. So one thing to think about if you're removing periwinkle is it might destabilize the soil. So if I were to remove this periwinkle, I'd probably want to make sure it was safe and check with the municipality before I did it, because it could destabilize that path. It's the one good thing about periwinkle, or I guess the one sort of good function of it, is it does stabilize soil. I mean, it's not the plant that you want to be stabilizing the soil, but it does do it. So, and so of the sightings in Victoria, it appears that 158 were greater periwinkle and 102 were lesser periwinkle. So it sounds as though there's reliably at least 2 species that are established here. So some native plant alternatives for periwinkle. There was I think it was the BC Invasive Council. They had a list of possible alternatives for periwinkle. These would provide the same sort of ground cover as periwinkle would, but they were native, and they would be native and not as invasive. Different wild strawberries may provide that same cover. They sort of reproduce the same way. They use stolons. They take up ground pretty well. Plus, they produce delicious fruit, which is always a bonus. So that's one possibility. Kinnikinnick or bearberry, it's a prostrate shrub, so it's a shrub that kind of creeps on the ground. That's another one they mentioned. Also provides excellent ground cover. Bunchberry. So you might notice, just looking at the flower, what kind of flower this looks like. It's actually called, I think it's called creeping dogwood. So it's actually a relative of the dogwood tree, which is surprising because it's so short and the tree is so tall. But that also provides excellent ground cover. And then there's the false lily of the valley. This one, I think you'll recognize it if you go into a park or in like a temperate rainforest park and the soil is really moist. It loves moist soil. So if you have it growing in a place where there's very moist soil, false lily of the valley would be a good example of ground cover. Some of the other ones that I didn't have photos in my roll for were small flowered alum root, Queen's cup, piggy black plant, redwood sorrel, and let's see, it's low fast cotoneaster. So those were the last ones. So All right. So these are the references I used, and that is my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Cassandra. That was great. And
Thanks, Z.
yeah, we'll have Dorsa next.
Hi. So I chose the invasive giant hogweed because on top of its ecological impacts, it also has a huge social impact because it's like a human health hazard. So it actually produces a toxic sap that if you get on your skin, it can actually burn you in sunlight. And according to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, it's noted as one of the most dangerous plants in Canada. And in fact, it was such a problem that in England that an English rock band called Genesis actually made a song about it called Return of the Giant Hogweed in 1971 that highlights some of its infamous properties and invasiveness. So on the side is part of the lyrics are turn and run, nothing can stop them. Around every river and canal, their power is growing. And while it has a lot of bad parts, the giant hogweed is not all bad. There are actually some places, such as in Iran, where they collect the seeds and they use it to make spices. So, oh, sorry. And giant hogweed is a plant from the carrot and parsley family, and it originated in Western Asia and was likely brought to North America as an ornamental plant because of its very bold properties. And right now it's found in the lower mainland in Fraser Valley, in the Gulf Islands, and central to southern Vancouver Island. And it likes to grow in disturbed areas with moist soil. And it's very tolerant to different conditions, so it can take over and rapidly spread. And as the name suggests, it's giant, so it can grow up to 5 meters tall. And you can see in this picture, compared to a human, it's much bigger. And it's also named hogweed because hogs can apparently eat it with no apparent harmful effects. And also other livestock and cattle can eat it. And that's actually looked at as one possible biocontrol mechanism for it. And it's highly invasive, so it outcompetes native plants due to its rapid spreading, and it's highly tolerant to shade and other conditions, so it's very adaptable. And wherever it takes over, it reduces biodiversity, and it takes over pretty aggressively. And as you can see in this picture, it's really dense, so underneath it, not much can really grow. Its large size also limits recreational areas and prevents animal movement. And it can also cause soil erosion, especially along stream banks, and cause the soil to be unstable. So aside from its ecological impacts, it's also a public health concern. So the sap contains a chemical called furanocoumarins, which are actually also found in grapefruit. So that's the chemical that causes it to interfere with certain medications. And in hogweed, this chemical causes phytophotodermatitis, which just means that it's a plant-induced, it can cause inflammation of the skin when exposed to sunlight. And so basically what it does is it prevents your skin's ability from being able to block the sunlight. So if you get on your skin, within about 15 minutes, sunlight can cause a very severe skin reaction. So it's very important that if you do get it on your skin, to immediately seek medical attention. And it's also important to note that these effects can be seen for many years after getting it on your skin, so you have to take certain precautions later on when in sunlight. So it's really important to avoid getting it on you. So if you see it, don't touch it. So because of this, it's really important to be able to identify it. So it's characterized, you can see by its flowers that it has very big white flowers, which typically bloom mid-August in BC. And it kind of looks like an inverted umbrella from the stem where the flowers come out, and the flowers can be up to 1.5 meters in diameter. Their stems are also very thick and hollow, and they usually have purple blotches or spots on them and really rigid white hairs. And the leaves are also very big. They're also very shiny, and they have jagged edges. And as I stated, it's very big, so it can grow up to 5 meters when mature. So there's also a lot of lookalikes in BC, so it's important to be able to distinguish between them. So one of the most commonly mistaken plants for hogweed is called cow parsnip, which is also in the same family. And it also has phototoxic effects as well, but less severe than the hogweed. And a main way of characterizing between these two is that hogweed has more shiny leaves, whereas cow parsnip is not shiny. Another way is from the stem. So giant hogweed has these very characteristic purple blotches or spots, whereas cow parsnip does not. It may be slightly purple, but you won't see them as blotches. And another thing is that cow parsnip is shorter than hogweed. And another plant that is commonly mistaken for giant hogweed is called angelica, which is also known as wild celery. And this is also much shorter. It is important to note, though, that when the giant hogweed is not mature yet, it will seem shorter. So you will have to use other ways to identify it. And a common way to do this is the app called iNaturalist, where you can just take a picture of it and it will help you to identify what plant it is. And other experts can also comment on it to really make sure what it is. So how can we help? So because this is a really big problem, it is important for everyone to help reduce the impacts of giant hogweed in our area. So the main way that is recommended to help is by preventing the spread of giant hogweed. So some things you can do are planting native species instead, which you can help your local ecosystem when it'll attract pollinators such as birds and bees. So some plants that you can plant instead of giant hogweed, which are also very ornamental plants, are blue elderberry, Ligularia, Rogerzia, and Angelica, wild celery, which was one of the lookalikes that I mentioned. So other things that are recommended are limiting spread. So giant hogweed reproduces mainly by seed, by propagating its seeds through wind and water, and it can produce up to 100,000 seeds, and these seeds can remain viable for up to 15 years in soil. So it's really important to prevent getting these seeds around and growing more of the plant. And another thing is increasing awareness, which is really important for the public health risk. So especially telling children about this plant, not to touch it, and also being aware of your animals that may be playing in the area to prevent any damage and harm to them. And other ways that we can help are removal. So giant hogweed is mainly removed through chemical and mechanical control, but because of its health risks, it's not recommended that you try to remove this yourself. So WorkSafe BC has a toxic plant warning on this, and they recommend that you must have personal protective equipment when handling it. So it's often recommended to get a professional to remove it for you. So the important thing is being able to identify it and report it to the BC Invasive Species Council, and also using the app iNaturalist can help scientists in the area see where this plant is spreading and get more information on it to limit the spread. And it's also important to properly dispose of the plant, because the plant parts can cause the plant to grow again. And so you're not supposed to put it in compost, because that can contaminate this area. And it can also, the seeds can also get stuck in your shoes or in like bike tires. So if you do go to an area with hogweed, it's recommended to make sure that your shoes are clean, your bike is clean, everything's clean to prevent any cross-contamination. And finally, for sites that have giant hogweed removed, it is important to monitor the site for several years to make sure that it does not regrow back. Thank you for listening.
Nice, thank you, Dorsa. That's great. Didn't know you guys used the seeds for spices. That's awesome. Yeah. So last but not least, we got Richard and Julian.
All right. Hello, everyone. Let me see if we can do the sharing of the screen, and we'll start it off.
I know your tech skills are a little subpar, but
That's why you're
bear
here.
with us, okay?
Okay. Greetings, everyone. Take it away, Julian.
Okay. Hello. I'm Julian. You know that. We're going to be talking about Scotch broom. Eddie, you have to click it. Now do it. Yes. Good.
All right. Scotch broom, known as Cytisus scoparius. It's a member of the pea family, and when we talk about the leaves and the flowers and what have you, you'll see you'll see that it is.
Okay, so it's also a aggressive, fast-growing invader that degrades a bunch of native lands that are written there. Also, it prevents natural forest and prairie regeneration and is a moderately sized fire hazard.
It has an interesting relationship with a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, a symbiotic relationship, which makes it particularly strong against native plants. It also has photosynthetic stems, and so photosynthesis happens not just in the leaves, but in the stems, also makes it a great competitor. Normally native to Western and Central Europe, of course, including Scotland.
So in history, it was a symbol of plenty. Also, it was said that back in my father's time, it was said to be able to tame wild horses and dogs with its scent. Also, it was used to burn witches in Italy. So that's fun.
For those of you who are fans of Shakespeare, the royal house of Plantagenet may be named for Scotch broom. The Latin name is Plantagenista. And in that middle picture, that's a picture of one of the Plantagenet queens holding up the Scotch broom.
Theater note.
It was carried to the New World originally as ballast in ships that were going to be bringing things back. And also during the gold rush on the West Coast, it was used to pack whiskey to send to the miners. And that also helped to spread it quite a bit all over the West Coast of North America.
It was also used to line roadsides to make them prettier and to stabilize dunes, to flat stuff out. Also, it was introduced into Japan by 1670. Also, the seeds were available on Amazon in Canada by 1827.
Not Amazon, just mail it.
It's basically, it's like old Amazon. And it was first observed on Beacon Hill in 1849, although it was, of course, not Beacon Hill, and there is a picture right there.
Down below, that's a picture, a postcard of Beacon Hill in the 30s.
I think it's me. Is that me? It's me. Okay, so it is currently, but not native to, Europe, North America, South America, both islands of New Zealand, Australia, including Tasmania, India, Japan, South Africa, basically anywhere that the British were, because we know how invasive they can be.
It's on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of North America, in the Queen Charlotte Islands, in the Kootenays, and in the North Okanagan and Shuswap area here in BC.
It is also common west of the Coast Cascade Mountains in southwestern BC, and there is a lot of it on the southern end of Vancouver Island. We know from experience, we've pulled it.
Indeed. So you can identify it by its woody green stems, again, that photosynthetic stem. And if you look at the picture on the right of the screen, you can see the yellow pea-like flowers and the pea-like pods that the seeds come in.
The pods will ripen into summer in summer into those yellow flowery thingies, and also they blow up, so that's fun.
Yes. The plants can produce up to 25,000, or seeds can produce up to 25,000 plants from each of them. Fresh seeds can actually be viable in 69 to 98% of the time. So they're really hardy plants. More than 65% of their seeds can in fact remain dormant for up to 30 years. So 30 years later, if they're in the soil, they can still germinate.
Is that me? That's me.
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. There is almost 250 natural enemies. Oh, wait, what?
Mhm.
Is that right?
Yep.
Enemies, species of insects and mites that, like, I guess, kill it.
But we don't want to import them. We don't need more invasives.
Right, because that would be dumb. And also, basically, one of the best ways to not make it more prevalent is to not plant it. So, you know, don't be a stupid human. Just be smart. Don't do that.
And speaking of stupid humans, most of the reasons for Scotch broom being so prevalent in North America is it's very good in disturbed soils. And so it's a weed, basically. And so we want to try to keep our soils as healthy and as uncorrupted as possible.
And yeah, the very best way of stopping Scotch broom is to kill it, which is obviously a novel idea considering how much we've seen.
Alternatives are listed there on the right of the slide, and you can see the pictures of some of them. Some of them you've heard already in this presentation, both ground cover, shrubs, and trees.
Which we don't feel like listing because there's a lot of them.
And the slides will be made available. And that's pretty much the story of Scotch broom, with a picture of Julian standing by some 2 weeks ago.
That I don't remember.
It is, in fact, in bloom all over southern Vancouver Island right now. These are the references we used, and I can't wait to get out and rip those suckers out. Thank you.
I can, but okay. You click the button. Yeah, there you go. Good job. Now you click.
Over to you.
Now you click mute.
Sweet, that's great. Thank you guys. Cool. I think that's the end of our presentation. So if you guys have any questions, I see we already had a few in the chat. And Lena already helped answer, I think. So yeah, if you have any more, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For all the presenters, what's your favorite? Oh, there's a question, but I'll ask mine first. What's your favorite invasive species to pull? Or second favorite that you might not have talked about, and why?
Broom. It's easy. It's fast. It doesn't try to kill you. It doesn't give you rashes. It doesn't prick you. It just stays there. It's nice.
It's very satisfying.
Yes. And it comes out very easily, and you don't have to work at it. You just kind of meh. It's just it just comes out.
What's yours, Z? What's your
For me, it
favorite?
would be English ivy. It's just really satisfying. There's so much of it.
That one too. That's good.
And Dorsa?
I also really like pulling English ivy. It's for stress relieving. It's really good.
Cassandra? Yeah. Oh, you're muted. Sorry, you're muted. Oh, Cassandra, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay.
What was your favorite? We missed that.
Okay. I like pulling English ivy because you can pull really, really long strands. Whereas with periwinkle, it breaks really easily. But you can pull like several feet long of English ivy, and that's really fun.
So there's a question about the effectiveness of broom pulling and lopping. So Richard and Julian, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, good point. You don't want to disturb the soil when you're pulling broom, because the more you disturb the soil, the more likelihood you have of broom seeds that have been there from either previous years or from that plant actually taking over. When we pull broom, we try to then restore the soil as best we can. It's actually true with most of the pulling that we do. You want to make sure that you return the soil in a better shape than it was before.
Yeah, and there's a Facebook question, the same thing about broom, because is this the time of year to pull broom when it's in bloom?
Every time of year is the time to pull broom, but this is a particularly good time of year because it hasn't produced seed pods yet.
Any time is broom time.
I think the question from Matthew, I think ultimately my favorite kind of activities is when you remove the invasive plants and then come back and plant native species in that space. Because as you know, invasive species crowd out and shade out native species so they can't grow. But if you put the native species and give them a chance to grow, it actually shades out the invasive species. So you're trying to give them a chance to do that. So yes, remove and replace with lots of different varieties of native species, I think is the best way to go for it.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, like we've seen with the blackberry, when you have an invasive species taking over an area, it actually crowds out everything else, and it prevents a lot of ecological niches to be fulfilled. So when you get rid of it, you want to be able to bring back what the ecological system would be beforehand. So planting the native species in there, making sure you restore the whole area to the way that is healthy.
Also, I want to point out that, like the giant hogweed, there are a number of species that are not just invasive, but are toxic. One of my favorite species to pull is Daphne. And Daphne can also cause some serious problems. Respiratory, Amanda, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, respiratory problems, but also skin problems. Mm-hmm. And is also a very satisfying plant to try to sit yourself down and pull out the little guys that are coming up around the big plants.
It's kind of interesting because whenever we run activities in the Lower Mainland, most of the municipalities won't allow us to remove Daphne because of that exact issue. So it seems like South Vancouver Island's a little bit more brave, we're courageous. We just aren't able to touch them.
And we follow, like, there's specific, about 4% of the population has, they're allergic to Daphne, so it is an allergen, and it can develop with more exposure. So the more you're exposed to Daphne, the more likelihood you are to develop the allergy. I've been working with it for years now, and when I tend to find that I get like a little scratchy throat if it's been like 3 hours of working with it. So we tend to not just focus on Daphne for a whole activity because we don't want to put anyone at risk. And depending on the municipality, sometimes park staff do that, and we focus on ivy or the abundance of other species.
Amanda, that leads to a question, if I can ask one.
Yes.
When we're pulling Daphne, we always make a point of making sure it's disposed in a special way, because there are places in Lower Mainland, in the Lower Island, where invasives that are in some way toxic can be disposed of. What do people do if they have these things in their own yard? Can they still be put in the green bins? Is it better to take them somewhere else? What do we do?
Yeah, it's hard to compost invasive species from your yard on your property, because it does need to get, the invasive plant itself needs to get very hot to be able to destroy the seed. And so that's one of the difficulties right now. And I know the Capital Regional District is looking at proper disposal, sustainable disposal methods for invasive species. There is a facility in Nanaimo that burns invasive plants, and that creates biofuel, but a lot of our invasive plants still end up in the landfill. So it is the $1 million, if not more, question, and I think it would be a really good business to come up with a way to process invasive species, including the toxic species, in a way that benefits, because it can turn into good soil again. So right now we don't really have good invasive species disposal methods. There is a company in Parksville called Goats on the Hoof, and they have goats that eat invasive species that you drop off, but you can't drop off Daphne because it is toxic to animals as well as humans.
I noticed another question from Matthew about whether we get support from local government agencies. Actually, we'll one up that. No activity we run in anywhere it's always with support, being directed by governmental agencies. And it's kind of interesting because we receive best practices. Like, for example, Scotch broom. There might be one municipality that requires us to remove the Scotch broom by lopping it at its base. But then when we work in another municipality, we may be asked to like pull it out with a weed wrench. So we actually follow the best practices and guidance to the T from the governmental agency that we're working with to run that activity. So we do that. We do all of our activities in partnership, side by side. They don't happen without them.
Mm-hmm. And we have about a minute left. So once invasive species colonize an area, how long is long for that species to be considered? Oh, so like, eventually maybe the invasive plant will become native plant if it's thousands of years. So we're not sure. We'll have to wait and see. I think for that, we don't know that, but that was an interesting question.
Yeah. The invasive species kind of fall under an umbrella of like introduced species. Like we were talking about how we can introduce biocontrols to combat invasive species. So those are introduced species as well. The difference is whether or not they have a negative effect or not. Generally, invasive species have a negative connotation to them. So they negatively impact the environment and have health or economical consequences. Yeah.
And Clark just had I think a question, not an actual question, but yeah.
I did want to make a quick point about Amina's question. She said an invasive species, like Z just mentioned, it's invasive because it's causing damage. If it's not causing much damage, then it sort of veers into like a weed, more like a weed. It's not causing economic damage. It's not crowding out all the native species. So it's, I'm just
like lots of ornamentals, just because it's not necessarily from this area, it doesn't have to be considered invasive.
Right.
Lots of ornamentals that you can plant. And there's lots of ornamental varieties of Daphne that aren't poisonous and that are not invasive as well. So is everyone ready to break out into rooms to talk about ways? So the question, it's a discussion, ways we can address the impact from invasive species, maybe not including pulling it. So you have to get creative. This is a time that we will be, we haven't been given the green light yet to go back outside to gather in large groups. It's happening soon, but we can be creative and we can address these impacts in different ways. So no idea is a bad idea. And we'll have about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. And there's a presenter per breakout room. So they'll be moderating. And then we'll come and share some of the key points that we discussed. So I have the breakout rooms all ready to go. I just have to find where they went. Breakout rooms, and I just have to reorganize these ones.
Amanda, with the 14 participants, 13 participants, are we doing fewer breakouts or than we anticipated?
We will do, a few people had to leave. We will do 3 breakout rooms. So I am going to open the rooms and I'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Awesome.
Okay, awesome. So we have just a few minutes. So if there's 1 or 2 people from each room that can summarize what you talked about, they can go around.
I guess for us, we didn't have any specific proposals, but we're just kind of talking about how there's an opportunity because so many people are at home right now looking for things to do, to sort of let them know about invasives and what they are, and let them know how to safely pick them up and where and what to do with them. And I guess what to do with them, there might be some room for creativity on our end, like if we had regular, like a place to drop them, or if we had a community like a pickup service. But just I think there is some opportunity in the fact that people are staying home more, and there may be invasives near their home or at their home. Yeah.
And how about the Z's room?
Yeah. Amy, do you want to just kind of quickly summarize?
Sure. So there were a couple of ideas that went around the room, and the first was just about reporting and growing a data set so we can understand the impact better. Another item that came up was just increasing options and availability at the local nurseries, and then having some dialogue with the nursery staff themselves, because there was realization that not all nursery staff are that familiar with invasives and the impact they're having. And I think that was pretty much it. It was just trying to find ways to increase the options and availability so that people can select natives over either non-native or introduce, and definitely the invasives.
Yeah, and we also had the idea of looking. Oh, yeah, it's just Matthew. We also had the idea of looking at like interacting with local businesses and organizations. Is if they're affected by invasive species, how can we partner up with them to kind of bring them into the fold as well? Yeah.
Great ideas. And I think the last room was Richard and Julian. And Dorsa. Oh yeah, Dorsa.
The speaker. So we had a few ideas. So one of them was tagging invasive species with biodegradable signs, so that people can know that, like, oh, this is an invasive species and it should be removed. And another one was similar to what Amy was saying, to get there to be a change in nurseries. So we were thinking of having a petition to get the nurseries to stop selling invasives and selling native plants instead. And similar to, I think, Washington and California, where by state they're not allowed to sell invasive species, trying to get something similar like that in BC. And finally, like similar to this meetup, having other online meetups and virtual meetings where we can connect even with physical distancing, so we still have that sense of community. And while we can't actually meet in person to do this work, we can use this as a chance to increase knowledge and awareness of these issues, and trying to get people that maybe aren't part of the green teams right now to also come to these meetings and learn more about this, so that later on, when things do get better and we can meet up again in person, we have more motivated volunteers to help out.
That's awesome. I think that's a perfect way to end. And I'd like to follow up, because we have been hosting monthly check-ins that happen once a month, and we've invited just certain volunteers, but we can open it up and we can further these discussions as well with what we could do as a team, as the green team, to address some of this, some of what you've all said. So I'm feeling very inspired. This was a really wonderful workshop. And it's because of all the community members and all the volunteers and all of the presenters. So thank you all so much for putting time into researching and practicing and being part of this.
Thank you, Amanda, for putting this together. Really much appreciated.
And I'm just going to put up one more slide that just tells you how to get involved, because I know there's some folks that haven't been able or haven't had a chance to volunteer yet. So we have our team here in Greater Victoria, and we have the Lower Mainland Green Team, and the charity website has a lot of great information as well. You can also contact me or Lita through email. Thank you and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone, and hope to see you all in person soon.
Thank you so much.
Good to see everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Good job.